All right, Steve, welcome to Straight Blast Gym headquarters. We bring you out here at least once a year. And I was thinking about what we should talk about on this podcast with everybody. I think everybody here knows you, and most everybody that pays attention to our podcast and watches is an SBG member, at least they know about the gym a little bit. And what I think people may not realize is I was thinking about this last night. People who aren't part of the organization might not understand exactly how it works. And essentially what happens is coaches like myself and like you, we work on different positions and different things related to fighting, but in this particular case, we'll talk about Jiu Jitsu. Mm-hmm. We'll get information, and we're always looking for the best fundamental information, which is why all of us have kind of gravitated more towards Rickson's lineage.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then we get pieces that come in from everywhere. But, you know, to give credit where credit is due, Coach Henry Akins has been a huge part of that over the last 5 years because, you know, he's part of the organization and he brought all that curriculum. Mm-hmm. But then you and the other top coaches in the organization will take that material and you will mess with it for a year or 2 years and apply parsimony and boil it down, and then you wind up with something even better in terms of a curriculum. And so, you know, that's what, and then what happens is we get together at the camps, spring and fall camps, and otherwise, like when you come here or I go there, and we wind up sharing that information with each other. And then that filters through the individual coaches at the various gyms, and it becomes the curriculum that the students are learning.
Right.
And so there's like a constant process of the curriculum evolving amongst the top coaches of the gym, because we're all working on different pieces of it and then sharing it with each other. And then it gets kind of disseminated to the thousands of students we have around the world.
Right.
And so for people who don't understand, because I don't know that that's how a lot of the other organizations work. Oftentimes you'll have a competitor who's the head of the organization or an individual, and then there's an official curriculum.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
You know, they're not constantly focused on the epistemology and the curriculum and everything the way we are. So having said all that, what you've been working on and what you taught this weekend here at the gym and what we just filmed is open guard. Mm-hmm. So talk to me about what you discovered from your couple years of really working on that kind of open guard curriculum you got from Rickson via Henry.
Right, absolutely. Honored to be here, by the way, always with you, and being able to spend time here, since this is where the whole journey organization started. Yeah. So, but to that point, if we're just using the open guard curriculum, what I was talking about with the seminar attendees was when I first met Henry, made the effort to go, a few states away and travel to a seminar. That was 2014. Following year, I had him to my gym, and what I was specifically interested in was a couple topics that I wanted sort of as my first touch points because of things I'd heard about. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to see his articulation of it, having, spent all that time directly working with Rickson during that time period that Rickson was actually really refining all the connection and teaching. Yeah. So Henry was in a unique position to be there to absorb all that. And so as it related to the open guard, I specifically wanted to know about what is this Rickson scissor sweep I keep hearing about. Yeah. So that I wanted to learn, and he showed me that. And then broadly, we just went through a few movements that were really the same movements that I think a lot of people who do Jiu Jitsu learn early on in their career as they start to be introduced to open guard, right, in terms of basic leg repummeling. But the added dimension there was how to create connection using weight distribution from bottom. And then we start to get
very different. It makes it a completely different thing.
It is a complete reframe on material that you assumed you understood.
Yeah.
Because everything changes when you have the connection where you realize you really can translate weight from bottom in such a way that it's not rigid, but it's more tactile. All of a sudden your legs feel much heavier, but you're using less energy. You're optimizing for distance. Yeah. And
the word you used a lot this weekend was sticky, which is a good way to talk about it.
Extremely sticky. And so all of the person who's trying to pass, all of their movements, their entries into guard passes become labored.
Yeah.
And you can feel them coming a mile away because your tactile sensitivity is enhanced.
Yeah.
And so so that was part of it. That was the first part. And the second observation I had, although it was more of like an offhand comment that Henry made, was he said, I'll grip, but just to attack, but I don't really specifically rely on my arms for control. And this becomes a recurring pattern in different positions too. But this is one of the common themes I see, part of Rickson's genius, where he can take the self-defense, the fighting jiu-jitsu, and where you're optimizing for distance to keep yourself from getting punched, kicked, eye gouged, whatever somebody's going to try and do, also can work for sport equally well. It's not just, okay, that's a fighting curriculum, but when I'm trying to be in a jiu-jitsu competition with no strikes, then that's not really what I'm using. You actually realize you can, because what you sacrifice in grips for control, you now gain in the distance you've optimized for. So there's this massive chasm between your opponent's chest trying to pass and your chest playing guard. And once you start to rely on that for your guard passing, you don't really need your hands for control, or they're optional for control, sort of like 80-20. Your legs are doing and hips are doing 80% of the work of control and maintaining distance, and then your hands maybe 20%, but they're really free for offense. And so that was a game changer. So this is essentially just one kind of private session for an hour with Henry, taking a few of those observations, and then basically going back to this heuristic of first principles that I like to apply, sort of distilling all this down to the irreducible components, and then working curriculum back up from there. And just basically going through all the permutations of how do I apply these principles to every type of situation. And then you start to funnel everything down into basically, this is all the things people are trying to do to counter that. And then you have an answer queued up.
When we have our camps, like we talked about our fall and spring camp, we just had our spring camp in Georgia a couple months ago, like 8 weeks ago. And then we all try and teach our best material at those camps and share new things with each other. And one of my point behind my class was, I actually think you could get a room full of white belts who were only interested in sport jiu-jitsu. Let's say they're not interested in self-defense. They never want to fight in a cage. They just want to go win tournaments. That you could get those white belts better at the guard designed for that purpose by keeping the strikes in than you would by taking the strikes out. And that's because I think it forces you to pay attention to the first principles, which is the distance and the controlling of all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of interesting. And I think that's, if there is people are wondering like, well, what's this difference with Rickson stuff and everything else? His jiu-jitsu was always about fighting. So he was always taking into account the other person could hit you or knee you or do whatever. And the moment you do that, it really does simplify your jiu-jitsu, doesn't it? And it also struck me that you were talking about, I'm not good with dates, but I was trying to remember how far back this goes. 2014 was almost 10 years ago.
It's gone fast. It doesn't seem like it could be that long.
9 years ago. And I remember you called me after you had that first meeting with him, which was 2014, and you described to me over the phone guard passing.
That was the other big topic I wanted.
That was the other thing. And just from me talking to you on the phone that time, I completely changed how I passed the guard, because I just went back to the gym and started doing it. And I was like, well, this makes a lot of sense. Obviously, I've been able to tighten it up with everybody's help since, but even just hearing about it and you realize it's logical, and then you start, like, just a couple sentences can change how you do jiu-jitsu. If you've been doing it for a while and you start to understand these types of things.
Because now what you've done essentially is, I always use context, because sort of like first principles, but then everything becomes about shifting your context. And when we can shift context, then you notice, like we always talk about, through this process of constantly trying to boil everything down and then work the curriculum out into pattern recognition and building on this epistemology that can disseminate throughout the organization, we inevitably all wind up having slightly different articulations of the exact same principles, which is exactly why your material at the camp completely overlapped with mine. You said it a little bit differently, but we're both basically saying you actually wind up developing a better guard using a fighting self-defense jiu-jitsu in a lot of cases than what you would if you're just practicing sport jiu-jitsu. Like your sport guard will be better doing the self-defense stuff. And that was a big game changer for me. And fundamentally what it allows you to do is, jiu-jitsu is not a complicated system, but it feels that way in the beginning. But what it is an irreducibly complex system. And a lot of people, on a fundamental level, we all do it. We have times when we confuse complicated with complex systems. And I think the problem is when people...
Or simple with easy.
Simple with easy, right? It's definitely, it's simple, but it's not easy. Right. Yeah. So when you're dealing with a complex system, there is a degree of irreducible complexity, but the good news is when you work from first principles, you can simplify it.
Yeah.
So my own guard became much simpler as I started to work this. And also you had mentioned like how I trained it. So I've found that this is something that's valuable for people where, you know, like some people say, I'm going to pick something to just work on today in class or during rolling. I'm just going to work on this one thing. What I actually did in this case was for about a year and a half, every time I touched hands with somebody to roll, I laid on my back. I didn't even do sitting guard. I laid on my back and I forced myself to develop this skill set to the point where I really felt like a handle of training with all different belt levels, all different body types, all different levels of athleticism. I finally came up with a pretty good picture of these are all the things people are going to do. And then that became really the foundation of the curriculum. And so I see, you know, all of us coaches will do these similar processes. And then when we wind up, you know, having little conversations, whether it's at camp, we're sharing material, or maybe sending a video back and forth, or Q&As on Messenger or something, that's where all this evolves from. So.
And I can't tell you how many times that's happened. In fact, it happens at every camp where I think people who may not know the organization or be part of it don't understand how it works. I never give any direction on what to teach at camps, right? If I ever told you have to teach this or that, it never happens. So I'll give a theme, and I usually wait until as long as possible to do it.
Bring it on, everybody.
And it's just like one or two words or two words, right? Like connection or whatever. And the only theme for the last camp was connection. And then as long as you're focused around connection, you can teach whatever you want. But inevitably, we all wind up having different ways of saying ultimately the same thing. And it's always useful to see other people's progressions and terminology and everything else because, you know, it's a different expression and different perspective on the same object. And then it gives us a better view of everything. As opposed to, you know, this one description is the way, you know, mistaking the symbol for the symbolized and getting too dogmatic about it, right?
Yeah, right.
So, and that just kind of happens organically every single camp. Like there's this kind of weird synchronicity between what everybody's kind of working on. And we saw that at the last camp with this open guard and the piece of connection that everybody was doing. And it's interesting.
It is.
And I don't think that could happen if we weren't working from first principles.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Because this, you know, it goes back to the same metaphor we've used for years with the Jiu Jitsu tree or success tree or whatever you want to call it. Is just, if you want to make your journey more complicated, then you try and learn a complex system as though it were a complicated system, which means you're operating more out on the outer foliage and the branches, as opposed to closer to the root. And so that's first principles. It is the root system, right? The ground floor. You go down as deep as you can, and then you work your way back up in priority. And I think it's difficult because a lot of times my observation is people immediately go, yeah, when they hear that. It makes immediate intellectual sense.
They think they know it.
But then in practice, it's like, but are you actually going through that process to do that? I mean, people talk about some concepts or something, but are you really like trying to get to the first principles and then work your way up? And then how is that actually expressed in your training methodology?
Right.
So I find that, again, it tends to be much more heavily focused on developing a game around a certain set of techniques. And then, you know, you're just, if you're very athletic, as we've said so many times, if you're very athletic and you're putting in a lot of time on the mat, you'll still get good. It's not like
and even then you're going to have created a system that is just kind of a hodgepodge of different things that you've tied together.
Right.
And it won't all fit together so beautifully the way it does when you're focused on those first principles.
Exactly.
You see the same thing from every position, right?
And also as you've, you know, I remember this was like a topic that you spent some time on a long time ago, like way over 10 years ago, but it's so true. Whenever people are trying to develop any type of mastery in something like this, you know, a game like this, their style comes out not just based on their physical attributes, which is what is obvious to a lot of people, but also on how they think. So there's the what to do, but then there's also how to think about it. And how you actually think, your personality comes out in your game. And so if you're not accounting for that, and then you start to say, like, I want to learn this game that I see somebody else, maybe it's my instructor, a senior student, a famous competitor, I want to learn that game. But it's not just, can you do it physically? It's also, is this actually in sync with how you think and what your personality is? And so the great thing about first principles is that that is universal, not just in the mechanical sense, but it's also universal where it doesn't really matter what your personality is, because you can insert any type of aggression or passivity or whatever. You can be, any type of personality can come out in your game based on that. But if you get too much around a certain type of game and particular skill set, then you can handicap yourself without that even being conscious to you.
Absolutely. Some of those games require very specific temperaments.
Yes. Yep.
That's interesting. So somebody that's watching this video, and we filmed the seminar, we also filmed an instructional set on what you discovered on Open Guard. What would you say to somebody who's watching this and saying, you know, what am I going to learn in your Open Guard set that maybe, you know, I haven't seen other places? What would be the benefit of them purchasing that series?
Yeah, so I guarantee you that you'll come back to a very fundamental set of principles that will translate to anything that anybody can do to pass your Open Guard. And it doesn't matter if you have an interest in self-defense or not, the same exact core fundamental skill sets that would serve you if you're trying not to get hit by somebody, if you were laying on your back and they were in a passing position, you'll find will actually be your biggest asset when it comes to developing fundamentals of Open Guard retention, and then being able to then open up your offense from your back. So you're going to be learning how to use much less energy with a much greater result. And you know, again, now having put this flight time in, I've not only seen the transition, the complete paradigm shift in my own skill set, but more importantly, seen it repeatedly proven over and over again with students of all different levels, from white belt all the way through to people who are already highly skilled black belts, through doing this at seminars and camps, and just, you know, now having exposure to hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of students at this point. So yeah, there's no question. It's it doesn't invalidate anything that you already have learned that would be a skill set you already have in terms of your guard, but this will just accentuate it, and it will be sort of your ground floor default that you can always go back to, and you can always use it to work less and get more from what you're doing.
So let's do a couple questions from different people's perspectives. So if you're talking to a group of students who are maybe, let's say you have less than 2 years of jiu-jitsu in, so they're probably white belt, maybe beginning blue belt level, and you were going to offer them a couple pieces of advice specifically tailored towards that demographic, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, you know, kind of the cliche thing is, stay off of YouTube, or, you know, like focus on this. But, you know, again, context is everything, because I'll hear these discussions where, you know, maybe on social media in a Facebook group or something like a jiu-jitsu Facebook group or whatever, you'll hear people ask a question about, what should I learn? What should I do next? And somebody will chime in and say, just listen to your instructor and stuff. And, you know, I would love that to be true. Sometimes it's like, well, but is your instructor the one who might be very good themselves, but are they teaching you jiu-jitsu as though it were a complicated system?
Right. Are they teaching you a style?
Right. Are they teaching you a particular style? The worst thing you can do is teach your style, as you know, right, as an instructor. But I don't really run into that. You don't really run into that, because we teach
SBG. But.
Right. We tend to teach fundamentals, and, you know, we'll have a few idiosyncrasies that are unique to our particular game and personality and everything, but for the most part,
and most of us don't teach those.
Right.
I don't think I've ever taught.
We don't teach them in class. No. We might do them ourselves, but for the most part, my game is 80% only those fundamentals that I teach. I mean, I just don't really have the wherewithal to want to do much else. But in any case, you know, YouTube can be great for exposure, but again, you don't want to get too far from the roots and the trunk of the tree. So focus on developing your understanding of the position. And the way that I think the instant hack is simply always ask, what is the objective of your opponent? And you work backwards from there. That's like a fast track to starting to identify first principles.
To reverse engineer it.
To reverse engineer it. And then we say, if that's their objective and there's only a few different ways that they can enter into that conversation of what their objective is, then how can I, with the least amount of permutations, right, the least amount of variables, how can I try to solve that problem? And the answer will always bring you back to posture and creating connection, right? And then from there we have all the different pressures that will be offensive or defensive in nature. But once you just focus on those things, the paradox is, yes, you're doing less, but you cover so much more ground and you do it more quickly. And then once you've done that, again, comes back to the Pareto principle. That's your 80-20. So you spend 80% of the time on that, then all the moves, the individual specific idiosyncratic games and styles and everything you might want to try out will be so much more accessible to you to play with, because you've got a foundation that's based on universal first principles. So that's always what I suggest. Just simplify it.
If we modify that audience and we now say you've got a room full of black belts, everybody's been training jiu-jitsu for 15 years or more, would any of what you just said change?
Not really. It's just a matter of refining at that point. Because now what it is, like for instance, you brought up the guard passing, right? So, depending on how you want to articulate it, it's only 2 to 3 things you're doing with guard passing. But arguably, as Coach Henry says, that could arguably be the most complex piece of jiu-jitsu insofar as there's so many different types of open guards, right? So if you're trying to pass somebody's guard, the moment that they don't have closed guard and their guard opens, you have so many variables to deal with passing, but yet you're only using, depending on how you explain it, you're only using 2 to 3 principles of how to pass guard. So then what happens is the level of between, say, a purple belt who's very good and a black belt is just simply going to be how little effort you can use and how refined you can be in terms of the small tactile nuances to deal with all those different variables.
Your efficiency.
Yeah, that's it.
If we define complexity as the number of variables, then for sure, then it almost even becomes more important to go to first principles. Otherwise, you're 100% guaranteed to get lost. Like, well, I have a past De La Hiva guard. What if he has like a spider guard foot on the bike? And then on it goes forever. How about gym owners? Because there's quite a few people who watch the podcast who might be teachers. They may or may not be part of SBG, but we've got what do we have in the organization now? We have more than a dozen, I'd have to look, but close to about a dozen gyms which have, like 500 to 1,000 members. So we've got some big gyms, right? And you've had a full-time gym now for 30 years, 25 years?
It's not quite 25 years, but I mean, it's getting there. Yeah, it's.
So business owners now, you're talking to a jiu-jitsu person. They've got a gym. They're doing everything right. They're trying to focus on fundamentals. They've created an environment that's safe for the students, where people aren't coming in and getting wrecked. And they're struggling, and they have, let's say, 80 to 150 students. Like, what's your advice there as far as what your general things that you would tell them to focus on?
Yeah, it's really the same, but you want to disseminate this into your curriculum. So, what we have to address all the different fundamental positions. So, in other words,
so like a fundamentals approach to business.
Exactly. Yeah. So everything's always going to come back to the fundamentals. And again, there's a paradox here, which I know you've addressed before, but it's always good bearing repeating, because it's easy to sort of default back to the status quo. But whenever you are trying to have a curriculum that's going to serve, 100 to 1,000 people, what have you, it's good to have exposure to different types of games and styles and things that people will encounter. But again, the better place to do that is just if you teach these first principle fundamentals, people start to inevitably, their personality and their personal style they'll have tendencies that start to emerge. And a lot of these different games they'll start to basically self-select into. And then when you have open environments where people are isolation drilling with with live pressure, and then they're also free rolling and everything, then inevitably what you'll do is you'll start to say, okay, this person continues to do this type of movement where they're essentially doing De La Riva, right? They just may not know all the roots.
Right.
And then you can start to go, right? Now we start having a little bit of a De La Riva conversation. That's the point where you or one of their training partners or something like that can start to give them specific guidance around those things. And next thing you know, everybody's learning exactly the same curriculum, but again, it's not the instructor's style, it's standardized, it's first principles that they're learning. And then everybody has completely different games. And from that same exact input, you'll have all these different outputs, and everybody will start, like you'll have the De La Riva person, the reverse De La Riva person, the leg lock person, you know, because people just do that. But everybody started learning a curriculum that's very close to the root system.
That's the great irony, and I know so many people that completely misunderstand this point, and part of it I think is stubbornness and unwillingness to truly look with an open mind, but part of it too is just semantic.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But they hear the word fundamental, and then they equate that with fundamentalists, and in their mind they're thinking everybody's everybody's going to be doing the same thing, and it's all going to be robotic. Yeah, and it's actually the exact fucking opposite of that. The more fundamental, in terms of more you stick to first principles, unless you get in micromanage your students' evolutionary process of their game, the more different everybody is. When you go to when you go to an SBG gym, I'd get to travel to all the different SBG gyms. Probably really the only person that's been able to do that just because of the job. You know, often you will visit here or there, but I mean, I go everywhere. Yeah, I go to everybody. And there's no 2 purple belts at any of those gyms that are the same. Right. They're all completely different.
Yeah.
And I don't often go to or get, intermingle at other gyms that aren't SBGs anymore just because I don't have the time. But when I have, and I've gone to other schools, and I've walked into schools and I've seen, where every purple belt and every brown belt on the mat is doing the same, trying to do the same pass, trying to do the same sweep. And that's an instructor, that their instructor teaches his or her style.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's the opposite. You're actually taking away creativity. And that might be an instructor who shows 4,000 techniques every time you show up in a class. And that's their idea of giving people options.
Yes.
But in the reality in that environment, everybody winds up doing the exact same thing. And it's so counterintuitive, I think, for a lot of people who don't understand to give students the most freedom to express themselves.
This is it.
You need to restrict yourself to fundamentals. And I don't know why that's so hard for some people to understand. Maybe it's a process you have to go through yourself. I'm not quite sure. But maybe it's thinking, maybe it's just, who knows. But
yeah, I think so. It's in every field of endeavor. So here's one of the things, I've referenced like Elon Musk before with the whole first principles thing. Basically,
or Ray Dalio.
Ray Dalio too. Like there's so many. There's Larry Ellison. There's a lot of these people. Often we become aware of them in the business domain because they get famous that way because of the level of success. But really, there's always first principle thinkers in every domain. And what is common is, if they're being honest, they'll often tell you, like, look, it's really hard to do this in terms of thinking of first principles. Like, if you can do true first principles thinking in maybe 1, 2, maybe 3 domains, you're already like well ahead of the curve, because we can't, like, you can just being aware of it and having some in depth with it, you won't stray too far from it. But even so, if you don't have the time and energy in a particular field of domain, it's hard to delve down to the true root system.
You may be giving them a little too much. You're giving them too much slack. I mean, hard, yes. I'm not disagreeing with you, but that's just people being lazy when it comes to applying their intellect to the art. They don't want us. Yeah, you and I think about Jiu Jitsu, and that's why we develop the curriculum the way we do, but I'm not like...
Well, let me finish.
Like sweating, trying to figure out Jiu Jitsu.
No, of course not. No. But I think the point is, the reason why it's difficult is because the pull of conventional wisdom is so hard. Yeah. Or is so strong. So, because this is what, Elon Musk says. I always say, like, you want to get a quick synopsis, like, there's a couple videos that are readily available on a YouTube search, like Elon Musk First Principles, and he just gives like these great concise talks on them from some interviews.
So going against the grain is difficult.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So doing the work of first principles, because the status quo is a status quo for a reason.
Yeah.
And the thing is, status quo, conventional wisdom, or reasoning by analogy, they're all kind of terms for the same thing. There's such a default that it almost becomes like a meme, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like a brain meme. And so it's such a default, and the thing is, it's never false, fully false. It's only somewhat false, you know?
Sure.
And so like it can be largely true,
right?
But then you completely have a blind spot that you're operating from.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about like an epistemology, people just sort of default in jiu-jitsu. The perfect example is like, well, you know, I've heard this stated so many times in different ways, but like, they go back to reasoning from authority or status quo bias, and it'll be like, you know, why don't you just do it the way that so-and-so does it? Right. Because look at the proof, or
he wins in competitions.
Yeah, or they've been doing it this way for years. Right. So who are you to say? And it's just like, but it's not about, you know, it's not about whose junk is bigger, right? It's just about what's true.
Right.
And is it more efficient? You know, like, so if Rickson himself, if there's anybody that I would be tempted to do argument from authority and give him that benefit of the doubt, it'd be Rickson. But if he said something preposterous about jiu-jitsu, I'd be like, well, you're a genius everywhere, sir, but when it comes to that thing, that's not first principles.
Sure.
Like, you just deviated, because the truth is the truth. So that's the thing. But I think it's really easy to just go, look, I respect my lineage, my teacher, what have you, which you should, but then this is the way I was taught, so this is the way we do it. And we've had success. It's like, yeah, the conventional wisdom became conventional for a reason, because you can be successful. But usually you'll find that when it gets too concrete, it becomes too rigid, too ossified, right? Then there's always some deviation away from first principles, which is why you need to keep your thinking fresh and back close to the roots of the tree. Yeah.
I could see if there's somebody who thinks that if you're reading a challenging nonfiction book, let's say you're picking up a science or philosophy book, if you view reading a challenging nonfiction book like that as work, then this is probably not for you.
Yeah.
You know, if the entertainment you want is mindless, where you basically just you just want to shut down your critical thinking skills and just like absorb some stupid movie or TV show, if that's what you enjoy, then this is probably not for you. But that's the level of, that's also, I mean, I'm basically describing people who are intellectually lazy.
That's it.
There's a big level of that.
Right. But here, you know, the other thing is, look, there's again different context. So a lot of people are willing, because a lot of this, your willingness to do this gets wrapped up in unconscious things like status.
Sure.
So a lot of people are willing to say, like some of us that came from, you know, more of a traditional martial arts background and had some real gaps, and then we were willing to drop our status to go into a different domain as a beginner, and then have the truth be more important, humble ourselves, fail over and over again, and turn in the pursuit of getting competence in something that we know is more aligned to reality. But a lot of people who are willing to do that, like, and learn jiu-jitsu, learn a functional martial art that's real, still there's another layer of that where they aren't willing to drop their status to say, I might have missed the boat here. I might be unconscious to this particular way of thinking about the art. So I'm going to kind of stay in my lane, which is more status quo, conventional wisdom about how to teach and coach and think about this, because it's easier. Again, it is still intellectual laziness, but a lot of times it's just simply an operative blind spot, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's something profoundly undignified about anti-intellectual.
Yeah. You and I find that annoying. I just don't. A lot of people just don't seem to find it. Yeah.
Is there anything else you would like to add or talk about on that as far as your set? You know, anything we're missing? Anything you want people to know?
Pretty much, I think, you know, that's the broad synopsis, what we were just talking about. And then, you know, first we're talking about make your guard really difficult to pass by being able to control with your lower body. And then starting to get into an introduction of really how to then start to add, you know, your other limbs, your upper body, for the purposes of offense. And yeah, again, I think the big takeaways there, well, you realize you can do a lot more with a lot less. And then as opposed to focusing on, there's this just move after move after move after move, instead you realize once I've gotten some real competency with these fundamentals, you'll actually feel that your offensive capabilities go up dramatically.
For sure.
And you'll start to find people basically winding up in the positions you always wanted them to be in, but struggled to get them into.
Yeah.
So one of the ways I came up with this articulation, and I actually ran it by Henry after I'd been working on this material for a while. I said it earlier today at the seminar, but if the first principle of guard passing is get close, specifically meaning get chest to chest with your opponent, then the inverse with open guard is stay away, meaning as they're trying to get chest to chest, your goal becomes having them fall chest to hips, which means there's some degree of they're a bit off balance. They're in a recovery mode. And whenever somebody's in your chest or belly area, as opposed to getting chest to chest and they aren't under control, that means they're in the danger zone, right? That's where all the sweep attempts, the reversals, the submissions happen for the most part, is right in that zone. Yeah, they're in the pocket. So that's, again, one of those counterintuitive to conventional thinking things that happens when you work this, is that you'll find you're focusing a little bit less on the offense to begin with, but it creates your offense gets better, and your
rock solid defense that forces them to make those mistakes.
That's exactly right. And then it's like supercharging your open guard once you start to add the offensive pressures in there. Yeah.
So before we go, so you were working on open guard.
Mm-hmm.
What are you working on now that you plan on teaching in the future here? What have you been spending time on the mat with?
So right now I'm in the process of, I kind of cycled back around to top game is my primary focus. And again,
some of that when we were in Birmingham. And
yes, yeah. So really what I'm trying to do there is I'm in the relentless pursuit of being ridiculously heavy, but also ridiculously relaxed.
Yeah.
And this again is one of those things. I've had, some really insightful, back and forth with Henry on this, where this is another hallmark of Rickson that, again, is completely, it's just intellectual until you start to feel this, where even really good black belts who are very efficient could maybe, roll at a very brisk pace for an hour straight without getting tired, clearly efficient, right? They're not spazzing out, they're not death gripping everything. And we know some black belts that can do that, and they're not even particularly good physical condition. So they are efficient, but they're sort of that other level. And this again is a perfect, Rickson is a perfect example of that, that I couldn't really fully appreciate it until, I started working with Henry and felt some of his movement and what it specifically felt like in certain places. But there's that degree of just, you are not tense in any part of your body. And there's that sort of lingering small amount of tension that even really skilled jiu-jitsu players carry, that simply doesn't need to be there, but it becomes so ingrained that you're unconscious to it. And so now being made aware of that, there's some places where I'm trying to shave that off and be mindful of it. Just like in the beginning, this is sort of the more advanced equivalent of white belts that aren't aware when they hold their breath.
Sure.
But we may have like a little bit too much tension in part of our body. Right. And so I'm continuing to try and shave that off without diluting, the effectiveness of my game, right? So it's that balance always between effective and efficient. And as I solve problems from top, I'm always trying to think, can I be as close to falling asleep even if I'm actively trying to pass somebody's guard who's got an active guard? Right. And
don't realize, people who maybe aren't used to this or haven't done it don't realize how much heavier you are when you're relaxed.
Yeah, it is so draining on bottom, but it's one of those things where, especially if you're already like in side control or something, you're not fully able to feel how heavy you are when you're relaxed. So you have to start to trust your own experience on bottom and the inputs meaning like, oh, from your training partners.
And in fact, when you squeeze, sometimes you may think you're feeling heavier.
Yes.
To a degree you are, in the same way that you're pulling up on a scale. But you're also all of a sudden creating this tension.
Yes, exactly. And that's where, again, you know, little tiny bit of rigidity in your body gives people more of a contact patch to create their connection on bottom.
To move you.
Yeah, so side control and passing, I've kind of swung, and, you know, being in top half, all those, they almost sort of become the same thing.
They're all the same thing.
Yeah, they've all, I've really focusing on, like, so a perfect example of this, not just the relaxation, but also one thing, you know, Henry said years ago, so I just like, okay, bing, you know, goes into the operating system, is he said, I didn't even go for submissions for, you know, like I can't remember how long he said. It was a long time. It might have been a year or more than a year or something. He's like, I didn't even go for submissions. All I did was lay on people, and I wouldn't allow my knees to touch the mat, and I would just wait for them to tap to pressure, just from getting worn down.
Right.
Pretty much what I've been working on. You know? And so yeah. And, you know, again, it's just, it's not. It doesn't
get much more efficient than that.
Exactly. It's not sexy, but man, when you pay, it pays dividends when you do that work. So
people are used to that pressure.
Yeah.
I've talked to Howder about this too, and we think about, like, you know, I'm not one of those guys that, like, jiu-jitsu these days, it's all like, you know, it's getting ruined and that kind of, it's natural evolution.
It is, yeah.
And there's going to be people who are just going to be no-gi, jiu-jitsu grappling only, and not interested by it. MMA is going to have its own version of it because of the short time limits and everything else.
Yep.
And then you've got the IBJJF, which is going to evolve according to those rule sets. And I'm fine with all that. It's never going to affect the jiu-jitsu I teach, which is jiu-jitsu for fighting. But if I look broadly speaking, and there's always going to be an exception to the rule, but if I look broadly speaking at the level of competitors, the top level competitors these days, the vast majority of them move so well and so quick and so fast and so smooth. But if I was going to list one thing that I feel has gone away a little bit, I see it coming back at the very top levels. But among, let's say, the really good competitors, but not the world champions, if there's one element that I feel has been diluted a little bit, it's pressure. For lack of a better word, it's that pressure. And my thinking behind that is just, you know, it was primarily, I think, a Rickson thing.
Yes.
In a lot of ways. I don't even think sometimes the other members of his family had that same version of pressure.
Right.
And so how could they pass it on?
Right. And again, you know, there's different branches of the Gracie family outside of that end of the family that were like more known for the pressure side. Rickson was kind of the anomaly on his side of the family. But again, when they talk about pressure passing, we can get lost in semantics, because a lot of times what I see when people are like pressure passing is they mean like anchoring tightly into gripping and all that stuff, and that's not what we're talking about. You know, if anything, you know, again, it's sort of like you should be able to pass with your body and really not care if they're holding on to your arms and keeping you from getting grips, and that's the ideal. So that's different. And you know, again, we see these things cycle through, like you said, and it's not even so much just the world champions, because some world champions I've seen, it's very interesting. They're pressure passing, but only if they get past the feet, right? And then they'll hunker down and get pressure. But if you see, like Henry teach it, or us teach it now, by virtue of being exposed to that, you know, it starts the moment of contact. It doesn't matter it doesn't matter if you're at the far end of the spear, right? Somebody's legs are full extended and their feet are on you. It starts there. And so we see this now with, for sure, Hodger had that quality of pressure, which a lot of it, again, is invisible because it doesn't really appear like he's doing something different than other people.
And Gordon Ryan started.
And Gordon Ryan now, right? So you used to see.
That's more recent.
Yes, yep. You start to see more of that. I mean, the perfect example of that was his match with Pedro Marino, where you kind of get the snapshot where he's literally dangling chest to chest and his arms are just hanging, just waiting for the frames to fatigue, and his knees are not touching the mat. It's like a perfect example of that. So yeah, it's cool to see it, but again, this just gets lost on people because they just, you know, pressure means different things.
Show me the new leg lock.
Yeah. And, you know, those are completely valid. But, you know, again, it's not about the technique. It's about Like, how are you arriving there? And also, you know, what is your priority?
Right.
You know, it was a brilliant insertion point into strategically into the competitive game to say, look, I've got a pretty young crew of competitors here trying to make a splash. You know, where's our Trojan horse? Well, we develop an entire skill set around where everybody else is weak, and then everything's just about getting them into that getting them into that game. And then as everybody's rushing to catch up on that, meanwhile they're working on other things, you know, systematizing other attacking systems. So it's very bright. But again, for the people watching who aren't full-time professional athletes that are training, you know, hours and hours every day, six or 7 days a week, then, you know, for sure, you want to really make your maximum amount of impact with your time. You're going to be focusing on first principles.
Absolutely. So. First principles, people.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.